Up to this point, you are familiar with several important considerations when building visualizations. You have reviewed various types of visuals and you know which are best suited for particular analyses. That is one of the single most important things to get right as we strive for high quality visuals. You have also learned about the importance of combining emphasis and simplicity, doing everything you can to draw your audience's attention to the chart's takeaway while getting rid of anything cluttering your visual, anything that would slow them down as they process it. I'm now going to give you an even more thorough set of additional considerations that relate to specific types of visuals, as well as general things to keep in mind. We'll start with line charts, which we know are best suited for working with time series data. Especially when you want to compare multiple groups over time, you really just need to default to line charts. We've talked about this previously, but with line charts, I would be hesitant to include multiple axes. Let me show you two examples and point out the good and the bad. In this chart, the author is trying to communicate two opposing trends that really provide a bit of an interesting insight. Going back to 1950, we have been driving more and experiencing fewer deaths from car accidents. So I can understand the desire to include both lines in this chart. And since the relevant range of these variables is so widely different, it's important to scale these variables differently with two axes. However, which axis corresponds to which field? After a little bit of thought, a careful reader will probably realize that annual miles driven per capita probably corresponds to the numbers in the thousands, and the fatalities corresponds to the axis on the left. But we don't want our readers to spend too much time thinking about this, and even worse, they might get it wrong. So here's another example with opposing trends. This time the creator colored the axes to match the lines. They even colored the same words in the title, so you know from the get-go that travel agents is orange and is measured by the numbers on the right, blue is revenue on the left. Next, we know that line charts are important for time series data, especially for comparing trends for different groups. That said, you've got to be careful to not include too many lines. This example has a variety of issues, but we'll start with the fact that there are so many lines with so many different colors, it's hard to make out anything here. Let's suppose that we're the analyst, and the takeaway we want to portray in this data relates to the trend in performance for the copiers and fax product line over time, relative to the other categories. Can we see that in the data? Looking at the legend, it isn't sorted as far as I can tell, and it might take us a bit to find copiers and fax. When we do, we might mistake which light orange colored line it relates to. And in the early quarters, it appears to be completely covered by other lines. Not ideal. A few other things we could point out. This chart contains a lot of data labels, and while they can be useful to quickly communicate information, this is an example of chart overload. We have no idea which of all these numbers is important, which deserves our attention, and what we should be comparing it to. Lastly, I would also highly discourage the use of legends with this chart. There's usually a better way to indicate group categories without a legend, and they often lead to a lot of undesirable eye movement going back and forth between the actual data and the legend. So consider this revised visual. We've kept all the product categories, but we've now grayed out everything except the focal group we want to direct the attention to. We got rid of nearly all the data labels, but we kept the starting and ending values for profits, and we can see that copiers have gone from a loss to one of the more profitable categories. There's no legend here. The title itself helps us see that the teal line corresponds to the focal category, and we're simply comparing this line to other. Clearly an improvement from the original. Moving on to bar charts, which we said are great to facilitate comparison across groups within a limited time range. Here are a few additional things to consider. First, a word on orientation. Vertical bar charts, which Power BI calls column charts, are good when you're dealing with a limited number of categories. And if you want to show differences over time in a bar chart, I would limit myself to only 2 time categories, something akin to a before and after shot. Horizontal bar charts are preferable when you have long category names or many categories. As shown in this visual, if your category labels are so long that you have to squeeze them in with a diagonal direction, you really shouldn't be using a vertical column chart anymore. Rather, a horizontal orientation facilitates reading for both longer labels and in a situation where you just have many groups. Next, I want to address bar width. If your bars are too thin and there's a large gap separating them, This can make it difficult to compare across those groups. However, you've also got to be careful to not make them too wide, or your audience might focus inordinately on the area of the bars, when really, it is only differences in length that should be considered. If we compare this to Goldilocks, you're looking for something that is just right, where there's still some space in between the bars, but the bars are wider than that white space. We've also talked about the use of stacked bar charts. Let me show you a few examples to highlight additional things to consider. Stacking typically means that you're trying to show how parts relate to a whole. And that said, let's not compare too many groups at once. In this example, it's pretty easy to draw comparisons for product A, the light blue colored bars at the bottom of each column. But as differences emerge, the starting places for each subsequent group change, and this makes it harder to compare. For product B, the darker blue color, which is bigger, strategy 1 or strategy 5? This can become really hard to interpret. Let me show you a clever example where using a bit of color helped with a 100% stacked bar chart. Here we've got 6 survey questions, and the responses came in the form of a 5-point Likert scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And because of the color scale used in this visual, it's pretty easy to point out that question 3 had the most disagreement, and question 6 had the most overall agreement. Another thing that can help with stacked charts is sorting the data on at least one category. Let me show you another visual that I think is pretty effective. It shows for each position of government leadership, the proportion of it that is staffed by women. First of all, using a 100% stacked bar chart is clearly the correct choice here. If we were to use raw numbers, you've got to remember that in the United States there are only 9 Supreme Court justices, hundreds of representatives, thousands of mayors, and millions of voters. Making each bar out of 100% allows us to compare these otherwise hard to compare numbers. I like that they've drawn a reference line at 50%, which shows that while female voters outnumber their male counterparts ever so slightly, their representation in government is not commensurate. But especially with the sorting, we can quickly scan up and down and see that while 4 out of 9 Supreme Court justices are women, female representation is lowest for governors at just less than 25%. Again, I would call this a very well-constructed visual. The data unpacks itself seamlessly because of the thoughtful creation. Now we've come to pie charts. And like I've mentioned before, pie charts generally have a pretty bad reputation in the visualization space. You're probably safest avoiding them altogether. Some people defend them, saying that they still show parts of a whole using an intuitive manner. We're familiar with fractions being represented as slices of pizza or a pie, so it feels natural. And it can be useful to break up content if you're using bar chart after bar chart. But that said, pie charts probably face more critics than advocates, so like I say, you're probably safer just avoiding them. But here are some important things to consider with some bad examples to illustrate the dangers. A recurring theme across all of these slides is that you really need to limit the number of groups or categories you're presenting at a time. When you try to compare everything, you end up comparing nothing. People also tend to read pie charts in clockwise order, so it's important to sort your slices by size, placing the largest slice at 12 o'clock. We don't want our readers to have to jump to left and right, continually trying to find out which is the next largest piece of the pie. Lastly, never try to induce comparison by looking at multiple pie charts. Humans already have a hard enough time judging the size of these proportions within a single pie chart, but forcing them to look back and forth between 2 pie charts is really counterproductive. So if you ended up including a simple pie chart in a presentation, like this, you probably won't get pilloried. But you have to ask yourself, is this really the best way of presenting the data? Often, there are ways of conveying it better just by using a bar chart. Having discussed issues that are specific to different types of charts, let me review some general considerations to keep in mind. The first relates to color, which can be one of our greatest tools. We've seen how color can be effective in emphasizing takeaways, and we've seen how color, if overused, can be distracting. So when in doubt, use color sparingly. It's also important to be aware of your context when choosing colors. Color can set a tone. And do you want that tone to be serious or lighthearted? Are there any norms associated with the colors you're choosing? In accounting and finance, we tend to represent money and profits with the color green. Reporting losses means you're in the red, and in most cases, do try to stick with professional color choices. If you found this set of visuals in a magazine article about online dating, maybe the different shades of pink and red are appropriate given the audience. But would I use this color scheme in a quarterly business report? Probably not. One final thing to stay on top of: if you have some visuals that contrast different groups, be sure to use the same color for those groups across those visuals. In this example, the bar charts use the color yellow to emphasize something about a particular time group. But in the pie chart, the same groups were displayed but with different color assignments. That is a good way to confuse your readers, so be sure to be consistent in your color use across visuals. Like the first example from today, I'm going to show a before and after picture example to illustrate the remaining points. Remember, our task is to keep our readers' eyes on the parts of the visual that we care about. So here's a list of departmental budgets, and let's suppose we work for the marketing department and want to argue that we deserve a bigger allocation. Here are some things we could improve. First, the legend. It is completely unnecessary in this example. Just put the names of the departments next to the columns. Never include anything redundant in your visuals. There's no need to repeat department multiple times in this visual, and the y-axis title is completely unnecessary. Next, in simple charts, data labels can be a quick way to communicate the numbers instead of referring back and forth to an axis. Just be careful to not overload a reader with too many. Within reason, you can use discretion to tell the story with words. Use descriptive titles, and feel free to add annotations directly to the visual to help unpack it. If you use grid lines, keep them faint. They are not the important part of whatever story we're trying to tell. And if you're working in Excel, avoid all of the so-called fancy chart styles that they recommend, especially those with 3D effects. Implementing these changes can help produce a visual that is easier for your reader to process. In the next video, you'll practice critiquing suboptimal visuals.